Milwaukee. You live about 7 minutes after the hour. Aaron Johansson from the House of Representatives, the leader of the minority party, not surfing today, although with the removed knee brace, you probably could go surfing, almost, right? How are you doing with that, by the way?
A lot more mobile than
yeah,
usual.
I would imagine. Can you sort of? I saw a beautiful piece the other night on President Roosevelt when it was trying to make a speech, and it was the actual December 7th speech, and it was the most moving thing, but it took him an hour to get dressed to be able to get and walk to do that. Can you imagine? I mean, you know, you've had a leg brace on for many months, right? Mm-hmm. This guy had him on both legs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he had a cane on one side and his son on the other side, and just didn't want to show weakness.
Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing how well they hid his condition and how much they made an effort to. In fact,
pretty hard today to do that, isn't it?
Yeah, most people don't realize that the press pool is named such in the right outside the West Wing because it's literally put over the pool that was used for President Roosevelt's rehab.
Yeah, amazing, huh? Isn't that neat? No kidding, huh?
Yeah.
See, I didn't
know
that.
That's where the term press pool comes from.
That's where you were being in Washington, in the nation's capital, like you were. Give these little factoids.
You used to be able to actually lift up a panel from the floor and be able to look into the pool because they literally just built it over it. But no more, unfortunately. That bit of history.
Now, I always thought that the press pool probably came from the office steno pool, where you had the the stenographers. Maybe it's the other way around. Mm-hmm. Maybe the steno pool came because of that pool also.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're a steno, and do we even have stenos anymore? Not really. Stenographers, they were called.
I think just in court.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, speaking about court, after today, if you haven't got your Obamacare squared away, you're a criminal. And there are many, many people that accuse the Republicans of just using this to pick on. But what I must tell you is that if anything, and I know that this happens at the local level, because here in Hawaii we had a pretty good health situation going for us already, it is being criticized, but most people aren't saying to throw it out. They're saying to fix it. What role do we have in Hawaii in maybe showing some other states, hey, we have some other areas where we're pretty screwed up, but our health plan's pretty good?
One of the primary differences between what we've done with the Hawaii Prepaid Health Care Act and the Federal Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is a difference on who the mandate is placed. So the Prepaid Health Care Act, our Hawaii version,
on the employer,
right?
Yeah,
and the federal version places it on the employee, and so that's a huge difference.
Sure,
and you pay a tax at the federal level if you don't have insurance. Or, the employer can just say, I'll rather opt for the federal plan and I'm ditching my private plan, which is why when you played that clip over and over and over and over again, the facts
they had to sell that.
Yeah, the facts
by the way,
don't bear out.
That's not edited. That's from separate and individual conversations.
I know. I've heard it many a time.
Yeah.
But
and there were actually, we have 41 on that clip. But there's actually a job that was done actually by a CNN guy, not even a Fox guy. And there were 92 of them. Were gathering support. Isn't it amazing how there is a concerted effort by everybody, Republicans and Democrats, to roll out support for a philosophy by just saying it over and over and over again, figuring it's going to wear off?
Sure, and I mean, I think that's where you see the real gap sometimes between leadership and just politicking. Yeah. And any politician can say something over and over and over again and hope that it's true, but the challenge for
Signed
all
hopeful.
leaders.
That's where that came from.
Yeah. The challenge for all leaders, Republican, Democrat, Independent, is to actually make things happen the way you've said and led people to believe they're going to happen.
Okay, I have been so pleased at the amount of email that I get that either scold us or thank us for prompting them into getting involved in something, finding something that they could comment on, particularly in my fishing show, where the fishing community is this very loose-knit ragtag group of people that aren't connected with each other except when some bill comes out. And one I want to talk about this morning a little bit is the looming gorilla in the corner of the room, and that, of course, is the budget. And I do know that there are any number of bills that are really key that are going to affect spending and therefore expect revenues. And if we don't have enough money, there's a lot of people that are worried that some sweeping tax reform is going to come along.
Yeah, well, not to be too reflective of the weather, but because
April showers.
because of the Council on Revenue's decreased projections, both the House and the Senate version came out last week of the budget, both revised the governor's budget downwards. So
right.
they both cut, and if you have both chambers cutting, when we go to conference, it's not likely that you're going to have anything besides cuts. Now, what that means, besides just for the budget and for government spending, but also for some of these bills that ask for new spending or new programs,
new money,
is that their future probably looks like the weather outside.
I saw, pretty bleak. I do need to ask you this. Quite often, some of these new bills that you're mentioning that call for new rules and new government are great ideas. They are needed, and that's why they come up, right? Hopefully,
sometimes,
needed. Yeah, sometimes they need. But by and large, the major complaint we seem to get, and I want to ask you if you seem to get this sort of feeling too, is okay, this is a good idea, but there's also so many things on the books that are related, that are similar. Why don't we mandate that before you change something or put in something new, you make sure that you get rid of something old that wasn't working to effectuate the change?
Yeah, I completely agree,
Yeah.
which is why I continue to support something that many states have, which is called a Sunset Review Commission. And basically what it does is it sets up a governing body with some teeth that regularly is looking at what needs to be repealed and retooled.
And one would think that because a lot of these bills, and I'm sure that if you look backwards, it's no sense blaming somebody that wrote a piece of legislation 40 years ago, because at the time they wrote it, it probably made sense. That's why it passed.
Right.
But 40 years later, it doesn't make any sense, and yet we seem to want to go backwards. Would you say that it is a
Like
nonpartisan issue?
said.
Exactly. Would you say that it should be that this group that would be put together to do this would be a nonpartisan group? What do they care? They just want to look at stuff that doesn't work.
It works really well in states like Texas, and it's not just bipartisan, but it's done with people who aren't actually elected officials. It's an amalgam so that you have multiple perspectives, because oftentimes a legislator may feel like something is warranted if a constituent is asking, but it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else tasked with having to administer the program would say this is actually practical or feasible.
Let me ask you this, because I think this is semi-important. We have a look at that, and you mentioned Texas, and I remember talking to an orthopedic surgeon on a program that we were doing, and we have virtually no orthopedic surgeons on the neighbor islands because of malpractice insurance costs and a lot of other things, and
A lack of market.
Yeah, but a lot of these people have been lost to Texas. And Texas is a place that I guess addressed and came up with some pretty tough tort reform rules, and that seem to be working.
Well, they have some of those rules. They also have a fairly dynamic economy. They're one of the world's largest, just as a state in and of themselves. So they've got a lot of things attracting people. And what's lucky for us is that there are a lot of neighbor island doctors who view it as a calling and a mission, which is why most of the time they're taking it on the chin financially to stay there. But I think the state is also trying to, there's more that can be done to make it a friendlier climate for doctors to practice, to attract them. But I think the state is also trying to increase primary care provisions, either with reimbursement rates or different attraction mechanisms, keeping Med students here.
Okay, when we come back after a short little break, one of the things I want to tackle with Aaron is what's going on with the big look that's being taken at the state hospital right now. Speaking about medicine and care, we have some real issues, and we even have some very serious issues right here within the in the penal system. This weekend again, no visitation, and lots of money leaking out the thing. We got overtime, all kinds of stuff going on. We're going to talk about that when we come back.
Mike Buck, all Honolulu, all the time. On AM 690, The Answer.
Well, listen, we're looking for a bunch of answers. Right now, we're looking for healthcare answers, and we're looking for budget answers. Now, it's sort of interesting. Representative Aaron Johansson and I have been spending an hour a week during the session talking about things that are important and on both sides of the issue, both sides of the political spectrum. But we must talk about the budget some more because, come on, we count on our legislators to manage our money, to spend it correctly. And this is the first time in a long time that both bodies, by the way, both bodies controlled by the Democrat Party, are taking a lot of pot shots at the governor's budget. Not because the governor is spending like a drunken sailor, excuse the expression for you sailors, I don't mean that badly. But whenever there's a shortening up, Aaron, let's talk about that. When the Council of Revenue says, look, you guys just aren't going to play with as many dollars as you thought, something's got to give. And it seems to me, a lot of giving's going on, or needs to.
Yeah, when you go to zero growth projected, that's not a great sign, and it means that money immediately evaporates because the budget is planned for over several years.
Now, a lot of people are counting on things that were budgeted or included in previous administrations or previous years that are finally coming up to the front of the line for funding. And it's been enacted, but it's not going to get paid for.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is what speaks to the need for broader budget reform. I think people would be shocked if they knew that half of their budget the legislature actively looks at in general funds, and the other half goes automatically to special funds that just get administered.
Boy, that's a big number, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it sometimes it ends up looking a little bit like budgeting on autopilot, and I think we're trying to reform those things, but it's a beast to reform when that's how it's been done for decades and decades and decades.
Aaron, I did notice, and we talked briefly off the air about this, that several weeks ago, the Abercrombie campaign came out with some very nice, good-looking TV spots showing sort of a warm side of Neil Abercrombie and talking about this wonderful fiscal job he's done with the creation of this $800 million surplus. There are people in both branches in the Senate and in the legislature, Republican and Democrat, that are saying, I'm not sure this really is a surplus. What is it?
Yeah, it's just a carryover balance. It's like what you would find on a ledger. It doesn't necessarily mean, for your family budget, it doesn't mean that money is always going to be there and it's money you've banked. It just means it's money that is carried over that you're going to be used to fund, years out to come. So
weren't there a lot of people involved in this surplus that are waiting for those funds to be released?
Sure. When you get told you have an $844 million surplus, everybody out there on the street says, great, that's extra money, because surplus conveys this notion of being extra when really it's money that either has been obligated or is going to be used. So it's really many hundreds of millions less than the governor said.
However, you must say that there have been some prudent moves made by the governor in order to either be reelected or because it was the right thing to do, but maybe not enough. And what you're saying is that in its present form, the budget is just too fat and needs to be trimmed. How do people get to you and to your peers in both the Senate and the House, both parties, with their concerns? This has got to be the number one input you need.
Some people do. They have, and it typically are the groups that are easily mobilized, but it's a difficult document to look at. It's hundreds of pages, and if you're not used to looking at a budget table, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it's important to stay engaged. It's important to ask your legislator what's in the budget, or let them know what your priorities are.
One thing that I knew about you because of your background is that was something that you were sort of spoon-fed into learning. And what I'm worried about is somebody new. Right now we have the entire House of Representatives up for election. There are going to be some new faces. I mean, in Republican and Democrats, I guess. What's the learning curve like? It must be horrific to all of a sudden find out that you are responsible for being 151st, or 125th of a vote, depending that affects every single wallet of every single citizen.
Yeah, the learning curve is high, and that's why I think it's incumbent upon people when they're voting for someone to make sure that they trust that person with their money and their legal fate and their children, because that's essentially through
what you're doing. That's right.
Through the education, judicial, and financial systems. That's who you're voting for, is someone that you're giving your proxy to. The thing that a lot of us have talked in the past about eventually having term limits and things like that, that very subject would almost holler at maybe not having
a real quick decision about term limits, because maybe some people need to be around a lot longer so they can explain to the other guys coming in and gals coming in, here's how this works, and it's all about money?
Well, I think you can make the term limits longer.
Yeah,
I'm a
yeah.
fan of term
Yeah.
limits. I don't think any of us are irreplaceable.
Sure.
And you getting that new, fresh perspective, as well as people who aren't so tied to being career politicians, can be very helpful, I think, to government, especially state government. And so, but I do think institutional knowledge is important, which is why one just couldn't look at the length of the term limit.
Okay, one thing that we're talking about just before the break, we were talking about Obamacare and some of the problems that it's facing in the rollout, almost certainly to be extended and delayed again because it's just not working. One thing that I hear on the street, a lot of people are talking about, and by the way, in case you're wondering why we're not talking about email, is because we're getting an email, but we don't accept it. During this, we don't want to ever be accused of stacking the deck and predetermining what you hear or what you can participate in. If you want to jump in and join us, you've got to do it by telephone. And that's 296-5467, 296-KHNR. I know a lot of people want to know, they see two things over the weekend. One, that families cannot visit their loved ones that are incarcerated. And there's a lot of people say, well, they're in jail, they don't deserve it. That's not it. They weren't able to get it. And the other thing was finding out this, speaking about tough financial times, this huge amount of money that's being spent on overtime at the state hospital, because that seems to be a mess. Isn't the committee looking into this pretty aggressively to find out what's going on there?
It is. There are going to be hearings, and undoubtedly this will come up in the subject matter committees because, on your first point, being able to visit your family is
in prison, right?
Yeah, is an important part of rehabilitation and ensuring that you just don't become such a hardened criminal devoid of any ties to society that you keep on harming society once you're out.
One thing that I think is a danger in that is that, not a danger, but a big flaw in it, is that they find out literally minutes before they're going to jump in the car. And it's the day-to-day basis. It's like, who's running this place? Is it the union? Is it the guards? What is the problem with not being able to have a staff so that these things like visitations can take place?
Well, they've got a huge problem in the correctional system because the jobs are often difficult to fill, and it requires a special type of training. It's not just sort of sitting at a phone and answering messages as they come in, and it can be difficult when the laws that one has to honor sick leave and other leave requests, and so. I know that at least in the House, there's been a lot of inquiry into the leave situation. We heard about it a lot when, as the Finance Committee, we went to visit a lot of the correctional institutions, both on the neighbor islands as well as here, that's something that is often an unpredictable barrier for them to deliver the service to the inmates and to the public while contractually honoring their obligations. One
thing that I've always been concerned about, and that is the number of people that get sick, unquote, for the Super Bowl and for other big sporting events. And I do know that what you're saying is true, that you do have to honor things. But it seems to me that if there were more a sense of responsibility to the job, that you wouldn't have 25% of a group of 200 sick on one day, because that doesn't happen in the private sector. Not if you want to keep your job.
Yeah. And, I think what's the most difficult thing about this situation is definitely a job is a job, but after having seen how services are delivered in prison, and it's a difficult job, and I think it's one that the state probably could do a better job at looking at how do we attract and retain people as well as ensure. Well,
one thing that you're talking about is because of our inability to do that, we incur a lot of overtime to the point where some of these people that are in the prison system are making, in some cases, more money than their bosses. A lot more money than their bosses, because their bosses don't get overtime.
Yeah, you actually find that that can be fairly common across government.
Yep. What is common across government right now is we take a break for news. Okay. Well, we hope to get the answer. Right now, the answer seems to be what steps have got to be taken in the big square building by the House and the Senate to agree on a budget. And interestingly enough, Representative Aaron Johansson and I this morning have been talking just about that, and that is that seems to be a lot of support for some serious cutting of budget items that were put in by the governor that under better financial conditions and revenues probably would have just sailed right on through without being questioned. But right now it seems like the whole thing is in flux. What's going to take? What sort of massaging it's going to take? And where can listeners participate in this in input for the solution?
Well, some of what the media covers is actually a really good digestible way to understand the budget, because they'll talk about not just the dollar sum that the House and the Senate have reduced, but what areas they are and aren't funding. And so, for the average person, that's a good way to say, you know what, they may disagree on what are the core priorities and what they're funding. Clearly, they're both cutting. So let me see, whose things I support and whose I don't. And that's where it's really going to be reconciled in conference. I mean, you know that cuts are going to happen to the governor's budget, and it's just a matter of where. And that's what the Senate and the House will have to agree on in their budget.
Usually in the last part of the second half of the session is when the gut and replace happens that you and I have talked about a lot. Does it seem like a lot of the current legislation has to be gutted and not replaced? They just need to gut things out of some of these bills to make them either more tenable or even doable financially?
Yeah. So, some of the appropriations bills might get turned into, a task force or something that studies the issue that doesn't require an appropriation, just appoints somebody as a stakeholder for it instead of actually implementing something. But, it was fascinating. Last Thursday, I was on a panel with Senator Ige, chair of WHAM, and Representative Luke, my chair of finance. And, when you have both money chairs saying people who are coming in for grant and aids and people who are wanting expensive bills passed, you should be a little worried, because it's not likely that it's going to move. And, so there are very clear indicators that everybody is on a path to trim the budget, and that neither money chair believes there's a whole lot of extra money out there to fund new initiatives.
When you take a look at what the Council on Revenues are projecting in shortfalls and in changes, and then you take a look at some of the news last week that came out after you and I got together last week, there's a series of stories about tourism either flattening out or even decreasing in the amount of spend, as we have hotel rooms that are getting more expensive, and this cash cow is on thin ice. And it wouldn't take much of a world incident to really put us behind the eight ball again, particularly in the light that we're also looking at some serious military cutbacks, not in personnel or stuff, but certainly in new construction. So we got some really difficult hurdles to cross over here.
You bet. Most definitely. And, so much of our economy relies on other people's discretionary spending that we are very vulnerable to, economic woes from everybody else.
Okay, so here we go, running headlong into budget difficulties in this session. And then immediately after the session is over, everybody in the House has got to start campaigning. And everybody that wants to be in the House or in some other seats have to be campaigning. Big story yesterday, and it would be it would be too easy to take pot shots at the governor's campaign funds because it's on the front page. But let's talk about the reality of when you're in a small state. This shouldn't be surprise, but that we should have more transparency. It's one company in particular. Do you think that there's one company, which is, I guess, is a construction concern, that has given a tremendous amount of money to Governor Abercrombie in the form of $6,000 pops from almost everybody in the company that's in the upper management? It looked like they, quote, volunteered to contribute. How does that affect somebody's ability to run against somebody that has such strong union or business ties?
Well, it's definitely difficult if you are, whether you're Senator Ige or Duke Iona or somebody else, if you don't have the money advantage. Money is always a huge advantage, but I think what the gubernatorial race will come down to is credibility and whether the electorate is happy. After 4 years, it's a large chunk of time to build up either your reputation or to have to defend it one way or another. And I think the next election will be a referendum. No matter how much money.
Yeah, you actually were talking a little bit. Aaron and I were talking a little bit about this off the air. It is a matter of sometimes you can have a very well structured bank account, and you can spend tons of money. And we've seen here locally, even in the last couple of elections, where the big spender didn't get elected.
Yeah. If people at the end of the day don't believe that they're better off, especially when you're the governor or the president, which is typically the barometer for the average voter, if you don't believe you're better off than you were 4 years ago, it begs that question of should I change and should I vote for someone else?
We're looking at a number of changes on the national front. Sometimes, like this morning's news came out, and this should come as no surprise because I think that Senator Schatz was, if not the chair, was certainly the co-chair of the Obama campaign committee here last time around, that he received an endorsement today from President Obama.
Yeah.
In some states, that wouldn't be a good thing because of the popularity of the president. But here, it seems to be a pretty good sign of the times, at least for Brian Schatz. But how does that affect people that like his opponent or somebody else? It must be, how can you do this,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we rarely have contested Democratic primaries for some of the higher offices that aren't an open seat. But it makes a difference to the average Democratic primary voter, and it makes a difference in the psyche of the average people who are watching politics. But I think the great thing for whoever is running in the U.S. Senate election is, although national endorsements make a difference, and it certainly helps raise you money, which is probably why people care the most about endorsements for their commercials. In the end, we're far more separated from the national political scene than the average state. So, in some states, a presidential endorsement can make or break you. In this state, I think, if it's a localized campaign and people are either voting for their friend or somebody else, it may not always make the difference.
Okay, 296-5467. That's 296-KHNR. We got the phones going, and we'll get at you as soon as we can. What we're going to do also here is take a look at another area, and that is when we talk about campaign spending, there's always a push, and I know that it came up this time, and it always seems to kind of die a death. There is no limit. I mean, what's happened with this company that's on the paper is typical. I mean, it can happen over and over again.
And it has happened in many election cycles. To be fair to the governor, he's not the only person who's raised a lot of money from individual members of each firm, because the law is written such that each person can give a maximum amount. Okay,
let's quickly go to the phones a couple of times before our final break with Aaron Johansson. The number is 296-KHNR. That'd be 296-5467. Dwight is going to be the first one, then a perennial participant was after that. Dwight, good morning. Hello there, Dwight. Yeah, I got it. Gay, Dwight, how you doing?
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yeah, do you hear me now, Dwight? Hello. One more time. Dwight, are you there? Okay, I don't know what's going on here. Let's try again. Dwight, can you hear me now? Whoops. No, I guess not. Dwight, you call.
The rain is in the wires.
Yeah, you call back. Meanwhile, we'll try our friend Alan in Lanica, who's called this program 4,000 times this year. Good morning. Hello, Alan, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for Mr. Johansson to join you. And I have 2 points I'd just like to touch on. First of all, we have a magnificent opportunity to improve our energy balance on Oahu by getting Hawaiian Electric to switch to liquid natural gas. That would be a tremendous advantage in all sorts of areas. And the second point I'd like to bring up is with respect to the prison system. I'm all for having incarceration locally for the prisoners to be able to maintain contact with their families for, shall we say, first and second offense. But if you've got a habitual criminal, third, fourth offense, find the least expensive prison system in Arizona. And anyway, that's where the taxpayer's coming from.
Okay, Alan, that's apparently not going to happen because there's already this big move to bring everybody home. Mm-hmm. Is that pretty much a consensus, do you think?
That's typically the governor's position, but Alan brings up 2 excellent points, and just to address them really quickly, I think Hawaii, for both the health of the economy, the health of the environment, but also for our people who need to have, reasonable and pragmatic energy costs, I think we do need to have a diversified portfolio. And I think liquid natural gas is a cheap, abundant American energy source that we now have the capability. Well, we don't, but the U.S. mainland has the capability to drill and export.
Yeah, but what about the concern about the Jones Act? And
it's definitely something
that's to me, that is the big kibosh, because everybody's saying, well, yeah, it makes sense, but it's a slippery slope.
Well, it's something that's got to be, like all things, the mechanics of it have to be worked out. But if we were able to get somehow liquid natural gas, I think that would be a great addition to the portfolio. And then on Alan's comment about prisons, I mean, I think he brings up an excellent point that one has to look at, is rehabilitation and efforts to somehow rehabilitate, whether it's through visitation or other things, actually going to make a difference in the recidivism rate. And if someone is a hardened criminal, I think there has to be a range of options in our penal system for treatment.
I normally don't take email, but here's one that's succinct, and it's certainly not political. It's, by the time somebody has been incarcerated from the third or fourth time, it's pretty difficult to have family come and visit them anyway, because, the families sort of give up on them after a while. You have only so many hours in the day, and how do you use them? Judiciously, we hope. Okay, so I want to go back to something that Aaron and I were talking about a while ago. And since a couple of calls are talking about prisons and about, fuel and all of the stuff, it is fully 1/4 of people in Hawaii are employed by our government. I mean, and that's a lot. And I know that
the highest percentage.
Yeah, in the country. And that when you talk about a budget, that would be seemingly, well, listen, if we're the highest in the country, why don't we find a model of another state where they do it with thousands of less people, because that's a lot of money right there. So what is being done with regards to interdepartments? It's a broad question. I remember when Governor Lingle called for everybody to submit a budget, and then one 15% less, one 10% less, one 5% less.
Right.
Isn't that something that's got to be done all the time based on the anticipation of revenues by the council or not?
I think the paradigm in government, honestly, is changing quite a bit in state government. I suspect because of the Great Recession, but also people realizing that we're not having robust growth. We're not the tax coffers are not just overflowing. That in all likelihood, everybody's always going to have their belt tightened a little, and it's a question of whether it's tightened a lot or a little. But I think what we've found, at least what I found in my 2 years as a vice chair of the finance committee, is that there are a lot of departments who now are a lot more used to coming up with alternate scenarios that are less.
I think that's commendable. But I do know that there's still the mentality of if you don't spend it, you won't get it next time.
Well,
and at the end of the year, particularly, everybody's out upgrading computers or getting paint done or buying something.
And that's why I think, again, the point of we need broader budget reform. Chair Luke and I are both engaged in a zero-based budgeting pilot, which basically would change the way state government does budgeting. Instead of assuming the base, which is kind of like budgeting on autopilot, and all you do is tinker around at the margins with some additions or some subtractions, you're actually looking at the full base and the full financial picture, whether or not something is statutorily required, whether it's needed for us to function as a state, its efficacy, and whether it should be funded or not funded. Those are systemic questions that we need to ask, and we really need to overhaul the way we do budgeting in the state.
That being
to
said,
achieve more of what you're talking about.
And that being said, I noticed that a couple of states have come up with regards to, say, gun laws lately. One of them was, I think, Idaho, that passed a law that said we are going to protect our law enforcement officers from enforcing federal gun regulations that we as a state don't agree with. There's now 2 or 3 states that are breaking apart from the norm, and there's a big wonder in most states that have this balanced budget requirement. That why don't we have one in Washington, D.C.? Why, if the states can do it, why can't the country do it?
Yeah, the country would be much better off if we did. You wouldn't have to go through designing a poison pill that nobody's supposed to take that ultimately Congress took, which was sequestration, because you had such budgeting dysfunction. And, at least Senator Murray and Paul Ryan came together and got a budget done. But even then, I mean,
But you know,
common
when
sense.
a budget reflects an anticipated shortfall of trillions of dollars, that's not much of a budget.
That's true.
You know, I mean, that's just a printing press budget, right?
Yeah.
We don't have that option here. Is that one of the more difficult things that your constituents have to deal with? That, well, what do you mean? Why can't we do this? I've got my gang is a nonprofit. They need the money.
Yeah, there's always going to be need in the state. I think people are fairly understanding when they know that times aren't great, that there's not a whole lot to go around. But I think having a balanced budget, whether you're at a municipal level, a state level, or at the federal level, is just common sense.
Let's talk about the municipal level and how it affects what you're doing in committee right now in the budget, because I do know that the counties are all talking about we want a bigger cut of the TAT. The TAT is extremely important to the state's budget. It looks like they've drawn a moat around that number, and that they're just not willing to give up anything on it. Yeah.
Right, and they're also looking at additional taxing powers. They haven't. They've been less quiet about. They've been more quiet about additional taxing powers because they want the cap lifted, and that's still up for discussion. Quite honestly.
What about this? I mean, here we have had, and I can tell you that I remember good and bad times. I've been doing this for way too long. I've seen good years and bad years, more goods than bads, and we tend to remember the good times rather than the bad times.
Right.
I don't think the current generation of voters, or in many cases the new legislators, have any idea what tough times are really like, because they've never really had them. We had a scare, but we didn't really go there.
No, you're right. I mean, no one in my generation has stood in a breadline, and no one has parents who were in a breadline either. So, it's my parents' generation who grew up on stories of the breadlines and who grew up in a culture much more prioritizing savings and being worried about actually being in poverty, because those generations of Americans were actually in poverty and knew what it meant to sort of go hungry. Yeah,
and that's, I mean, we all think, well, I'm hungry. We really have no idea what it's really like to be hungry. Okay, one thing, finally, I try to get in every week some pet Aaron Johansen projects, and I do know that they're all to do with cost of living. What specifically this week is of particular interest to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot going on at the legislature, but I think one of the things that's just dominating the economy as well as land use and the environment, and sucking up a lot of the oxygen at the Capitol, is HCDA, the Hawaii Community Development Authority. Its role, whether its role needs to be changed, revised, and what sort of the future.
There's some people who are saying throw it out.
Yeah, what some of the future vision for Oahu and urban development is.
We have this, I think, a mind's eye picture, all of us, of the ideal way that it should look from the airport to Waikiki. This beautiful, lovely, I can walk around here, city and everything else. And the big number one issue seems to be, and my question today, is what is the legislature going to do about facilitating the administration to work with the counties, and particularly here in Honolulu, about really dealing with our homeless. I mean, we just can't be having these folks in Waikiki because the visitors go back to wherever they come from, and they say don't go to Hawaii because it's ugly, and there's homeless people, and it's not safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there's a lot more to do, and there are some solutions floating around the Capitol, but we still there's still more to be done.
We talk about maybe there's some models, and almost everybody says the model is here. We have the opportunity, and the reason why we have probably percentage-wise higher homeless than in some metropolises like ours is that our weather doesn't freeze somebody to death or hurt somebody because of that, and maybe that's why we have more people that need help. Mm-hmm. Is there any thoughts to that? Is that ever thought about? There are some states, and I know, and we're going to run out of time, but there are always people that think, well, what are we going to do about these governments that send people here? Is there ever any evidence that's come forth saying some other municipality sends homeless people to Hawaii?
Some people say that. I'm not sure myself, but I think homelessness is often more visible in Hawaii because you're right. If you're worried about freezing to death, you're going to go to a shelter.
Yep. That's a fact. All right, we're running out of time for this time around. We want to wish Aaron and everybody a tremendous amount of good luck and good fortune in the remainder of the session.